Ow, I'm bleeding! Abracadabra! What? It's magic! No, I think it was probably a knife. But did you see the knife? I guess not. Then it was magic! Arcane magic! Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, it's no surprise to anyone here that arcane weapons in Elden Ring are ridiculously strong. Bleed as a status is strong, and the other statuses aren't bad either. And arcane scaling weapons are the only ones in the game that can actually raise the amount of status on your weapon, and make those statuses even more potent as a result. But which arcane weapons are the best, and which are the worst? What about the all-important middle?
Right in the middle, beautiful.
Well, today I'm here to rank this weapon category categorically in the form of the arcane weapon tier list in Elden Ring, based on my opinions and hundreds of hours in the game itself, along with, of course, the statistical goodness of each individual weapon. This list will go over every arcane weapon in the game, as there aren't that many of them, and while I have tiers all the way from S+ down to E, it's important to remember that every arcane weapon in the game is good because arcane scaling is good. This is just a comparison of them against each other. Without further ado then, let's go from the bottom to the top, Veras Bouquet. This weapon isn't completely irredeemable, but it has a particularly short range. The base hammer moveset isn't great compared to even something like a warhammer, and interestingly, as a hammer it gets a Rapier's Ash of War in Blood Tax, which applies bleed with repeated thrusts, but even that suffers from a lot of the range issues, and if you are using it purely to apply bleeds, there are just way better Ashes of War for that purpose. This weapon simply falls behind the other arcane weapons in just about every way. It has no specific niche that makes it impressive other than having bleed by default, arcane scaling, and being able to have blood flame applied to it, but even then it's just slower at bleed application than the other weapons. In the end, it's just sort of alright. Instantly moving up a tier then to D, we have the Clinging Bone Fist Weapon. First up, it is a fist weapon, which makes it a bit rough to play around in the first place, though it does have the longest range of any fist weapon in the game, which is nice relative to the others at least. The weapon skill Lifesteal Fist is essentially a cheat code on a player if you can hit it, as it obliterates tarnished enemies, but has very low range and a bit of a wind-up to it too. As well, this can be used on other fist weapons. It isn't actually unique to this weapon, but you can't change it on this weapon. It's just sort of stuck that way. The scaling on the weapon itself isn't great. There are simply better fist weapons, and as I was saying, you can apply the Dash of War to other fist weapons, so there's other better ways to use it, and the Ash of War has basically no effect on 95% of the bosses in the game anyways. So while this weapon does have some uses, it is extremely niche and a little bit outdone by other fist weapons built the same way. After that, we have the Ripple Blade. This weapon is the only default arcane scaling axe in the game, and unfortunately, as it tends to be, that means it is a fair bit weaker than just a good axe set to Occult Affinity. It doesn't get a unique weapon skill, just having Wild Strikes, which is an okay skill, but not incredible by any means. Of course, the main advantage of this over an Occult Affinity axe is that you can still apply weapon buffs, and thus have interchangeable statuses that are buffed up by your arcane stat. To put simply though, this weapon has other options that just do the same thing better, much better, with a better moveset, longer range, and a higher AR at the end of it too. So this one winds up a bit pointless in comparison to that one that I'll be going over later. Moving up to the C tier then, we have the only bow on this list. It's sort of hard to judge a bow against melee weapons, so I'll more be comparing its general usability than anything, and well, it is mostly just an average bow with a unique ability to apply poison with any arrow fired from it, as it gives you 15 poison on any arrow just as a default passive of the bow itself. This makes it good as a budget option for a poison build if you don't have poison arrows and still want to make it work, but it is unbelievably outclassed by something like the pulley crossbow being able to fire 3 bolts in a row if you just want to apply statuses quickly. This weapon is usable, it's just beaten out at its own purpose in quite a significant way. After that, we have Reduvia, the blood-flinging dagger, and the reason this gets up to C is the weapon skill itself, Blood Blade, firing a projectile forwards that applies bleed and does a good amount of damage. The projectile isn't the hardest thing to dodge for a player, but if you hit, it does good damage from far away, and again, it has bleed buildup, which makes it an effective ranged tool for that purpose. But at the end of the day, it's still a dagger, which means the second your enemy is in melee range, you have to be an inch from their face or you'll lose the fight. Having the ranged option on a dagger does help quite a bit, but it would be just stronger on another weapon type. So as much as this one does work, it simply doesn't work as well as the others I'm about to get to on this list. Moving up to the B tier now, smack dab in the middle of the arcane weapons as a whole, we've got Morgott's Cursed Blade.
This place is cursed. Cursed.
This is where things start to get a little bit stronger. After all, this thing is a curved greatsword, giving it great range and a nice moveset, fast-hitting sweeping strikes for the melee part, but also a pretty decent weapon skill on it too, giving you a decent gap closer with a delayed explosive pop of damage coming after it, and even a follow-up attack to keep the pressure on afterwards. This weapon doesn't really have any particular negatives or weaknesses to it, but at the same time there is nothing here to make it stupidly powerful, a perfect example of the middle ground of arcane weaponry in this game. Afterwards, the Ripple Crescent Halberd, the big boy version of the Ripple Blade talked about earlier. This naturally arcane scaling weapon hits the highest natural AR of any of them on the melee swings, in particular when you go full in on the arcane stat, on top of which it can have weapon buffs applied to it, allowing it to take advantage of some serious status application, and not just blood, but the whole host of statuses can be used through this weapon itself, even sleep if you so choose. The only real thing holding it back is that it is forced onto the spinning slash weapon skill, which while not terrible, is definitely quite middling. Overall, this weapon doesn't quite break the game, but it allows for a relatively unique playstyle of choose your own blight and go, which is quite fun to actually mess around with in practice, even if it takes a lot of crafting materials. Then we have the Regalia of Aracade Straight Sword. This weapon itself is good. It's got the Straight Sword moveset, of course, which isn't bad at all, especially when power stanced properly. It may not have insane range or reach the tippity top of AR, but it performs quite admirably. And more than that, it has the Aracade's dancing blade, Ash of War, shared with only one other weapon in the game that will also be on this list. The Ash of War can hit for up to 15,000 on the right enemy, being about the strongest way to use arcane in the game that doesn't involve bleed. And so the only reason this weapon is in the B tier is because the other weapon with this weapon skill is simply better for the purposes of melee combat in general, while achieving the exact same heights with the skill itself.
It's just until Dad gets better.
Eleanor's Pole Blade is an exceptionally fun weapon that can be a bit hard to actually use, at least in PvP. In PvE, this thing shreds things pretty well. The moveset is interesting and unique from the other twin blades, even, but unfortunately limits the range of it in a weird way, making it a deceptively short on its attacks compared to what you might expect from a weapon of that size. The weapon skill is relatively potent, applying bleeds with decent speed, but it also flings you quite far forward, so you need to know your distance quite well before you fire off with it. I love using this weapon. I think it is visually one of the coolest ones in the game, but in proper combat context, it can feel just a touch awkward. The weapon is not bad at all. It is very effective, in fact, but it is simply less effective than the remaining weapons going up on this list. Next up then, starting off our A tier is the Marais Executioner's Sword, the big papa of the Regalia of Aracade. The range and moveset of the melee swings themselves are simply better than the other weapon, and the Ash of War remains largely unchanged. It can be hard to hit in PvP for obvious reasons, as it has a decent windup and a relatively small hitbox, but in the context of PvE, it absolutely shreds any enemy that you could come across, making a lot of the game quite easy as a result of just holding this thing in your hand. The next and last weapon on this tier is Bloody Hellas. This weapon has the heavy thrusting sword moveset, which is surprisingly strong. Essentially just a massive rapier, it takes thrusting attacks with forward momentum and then gives them an even larger range to connect with, and then combined with the weapon skill itself makes this an impeccable dueling weapon. The skill gives a lot of mobility to the weapon. It's super fast and can be used as an evade or even as a repositioning tool to get the drop on your opponent with follow-up attacks to follow. Overall, while it isn't the highest damaging arcane weapon by any means, it has an incredibly strong moveset for general use without even costing FP, and the skill that you have along with it makes you really hard to pin down and trap both in PvE and in PvP. Moving on up then to the S tier, we have the Moguin Sacred Spear. Of course, this is a great spear, meaning that it has quite long range, especially notably the sprint attack is just sort of nasty good. It scales quite well with stats and gets one of the larger ARs on an arcane weapon in the game, making its general melee swings quite potent as well. But of course, if you know this weapon, you know that the melee swings are just the cherry on top of the absolutely insane skill that the weapon has, Blood Boon Ritual. If you catch an enemy with it properly in PvP, you will destroy them in one shot, and honestly in PvE, you will kill the vast majority of bosses by pressing the button once as well, able to deal nearly 20,000 damage in a single go to the the right enemy. This weapon is what I mean when I talk about some of the other things having nothing broken and being in the middle because of it. They aren't bad weapons. Things like this are just stupidly strong. Having the high damage it does on melee swings, the strong moveset of a great spear, and then the absolutely bonkers weapon skill makes it nearly incomparable, except of course for the one weapon in the S+ tier.
Rivers of blood, hell on earth, quite charmless.
Surprising absolutely no one, Rivers of Blood is just broken all the way up the chain. The damage of the melee swings is super high. The moveset is that of a katana, which are already quite strong. Of course, you can power stance this quite easily with another katana and dual wield weapons with high bleed application on every swing, and if that wasn't enough for you, of course the weapon skill itself is just one of the silliest, most powerful things in the game. Each individual hit of the weapon skill is enough to ruin your opponents, but it of course hits up to 6 times, applying ridiculous amounts of damage and blood buildup, and past that, it is actually a spammable weapon skill too. If your enemy is using this, your only hope is to dodge it perfectly until they run out of mana. If you are using this, you will feel more powerful than Moguin himself, be it bosses or human enemies. This thing is ridiculous, and I will firmly say to this day, I think it is the most broken weapon in all of Elden Ring. And there you have it, everyone. The full tier list of the arcane weapons in the game, based both on their statistics and my individual experiences with my monumental amount of playtime. If you disagree with any of my choices, feel free to let me know, but I'm quite confident that this list is about as good a comparison as you can get between these tools of mass destruction. Like if you like the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.